Greetings everyone, and as you can see I am here in the pre-sequel, kind of like the black sheep of the Borderlands games. A game that is so hated, it has become sort of a meme in the Borderlands community. And there are of course reasons for that, but a game that I overall really think is criminally underrated, for reasons that I'm going to elaborate on in this video. Borderlands the pre-sequel was kind of living up to it had very high expectations because it was a direct, the first major Borderlands game, so to speak, after Borderlands 2. And the game was kind of like marketed incorrectly. It was kind of presented to be as a new Borderlands game, but what we got was more along the lines of like a Borderlands 2 DLC that was priced at $60 at launch. So that is kind of what's most responsible for its bad reputation, is that it was marketed and priced kind of like inappropriately. At launch, it had no sniper class, for example, so people who liked Mordecai and Zero kind of like felt left out. The you had no real farming when the game first launched. You had, of course, no way to reset your playthrough, but you had, of course, as usual, 4 classes to play. It had little to no replay value, again at launch. And overall, it just did not feel fresh enough. Pretty much most of the weapons were identical to their Borderlands 2 counterparts. This is identical to Borderlands 2. Even unique weapons were recycled from the original Borderlands games. We got a new weapon class, which is lasers, which are of course fantastic, but they did not, again, feel like they warrant their own game to exist. They could have just patched those into Borderlands 2. And so, yeah, at launch, it really gave the game a bad reputation. But, to me, it kind of allowed me to replay the Borderlands 2 experience with all the knowledge that I had accumulated. For example, I right off the bat did not ruin my bar, so that when I switch to a melee shield on a character that does require it, I am not hindered by, well, shield stats. I did not increase my maximum health and make things more difficult for me in situations where health gating is important. And if I really wanted more health, I could just spec into or wear stuff that gives me more health. So it allowed me to use my Borderlands 2 knowledge to start fresh and not ruin everything, because of course starting Borderlands 2 fresh is way too much to ask, because making your way to max level once again and refarming all your gear is very tedious, and so giving you a new game where you have a reason to do that was much better. I have to say that even at launch, even if you don't take into account any of the DLCs that came after and the changes that came into the game, overall I'd say the pre-sequel, in for example something like mission structuring, felt less tedious. Amongst the missions you have very fewer instances of missions that are just like a chore to complete, stuff that you really don't like doing. Most of the missions are actually quite fun, most of them, not all. You had less, I'm going to elaborate on this further, less instances of like circles of slaughter and whatnot. And of course the references are still funny, the jokes are still on point. And yeah, even at launch the game was not as horrible as people made it out to be. What most people took issue with, again, was like the lack of farming, which is something that, again, if you role play as a developer and use save editors responsibly and reasonably in order to just like improve your experience at the game, you never would have experienced. Overall, the pre-sequel was not as big as Borderlands 2. which could be interpreted as a weakness or as like a negative point. Of course, not all areas are listed on the fast travel. A lot of areas are only accessible if you go there manually, which again could be considered a negative point. For example, I don't know why the veins of Helios is not accessible. You have to like travel there either from the Hyperion Hub of Heroism or from Lunar Launch Station. And there are numerous other examples of that. But overall, the pre-sequel was not as big, but when that ties into my concept when I talked about quality versus quantity. While the pre-sequel was smaller, the quality of the areas, the feel of the areas was much more refined. When you revisit Borderlands 2, you notice how many areas feel the same. You start through the game in this ice setting and it carries over way too long. It was, of course, very refreshing and much different from what you experienced in Borderlands 1, where it was all brown all the way. And so, of course, an ice scenery was, even though it's kind of like a meme, like to make a new game, take the old one and just add snow and ice, but it felt fresh, but only for a while, after which it really felt kind of tedious. Here, like, where else in Borderlands 2 did you get such a scene? Did you get such a view of the Helios space station so close, of comets shooting, of galaxies, of like cosmic steam, of Pandora in the distance with iridium erupting out of it? It is a fantastic sight. It is a really unique atmosphere, so which I'm going to elaborate on, that the atmosphere with this game is much stronger in my eyes than it is with Borderlands 2. So it kind of, in a way, which is something I keep coming back to, it kind of elaborated on many of the strong points of Borderlands 2 rather than the weaknesses. And like I said, while the experience started off bad, if you were not willing to use exploits and mods and well, again, modding was only introduced very late. But if you were unwilling to use save editors, you could have had like a bad experience where you can't farm for the gear you want. And I'm going to talk about that, how that kind of like unfolded over time. I gotta say that, yeah, the overall experience was still better. I actually, in many ways, prefer this game to Borderlands 2. Of course, Borderlands 2 will always have more sentimental value. Borderlands 2 will be more memorable in many instances. Borderlands 2 is overall a much more beloved and much more like hallmark of a game. And emotionally, like I said, it's going to be superior to this one. But an overall experience of like gameplay, yeah, I believe this game is superior. And I'm going to elaborate on this in the coming points. So before I go over my previous points about Borderlands 2 one by one and how they apply to the pre-sequel, again I want to say that even at launch, which is where the game accumulated most of its negative perception or reception, you had less tedious missions along the lines of like fetch missions with timer. You still had a couple of annoying ones where you had to donate white weapons, whatever, which kind of gave you more of an incentive to pick up white weapons, but still it was kind of like implemented in a bad way. The references and funny jokes were much more funny for me in the pre-sequel. The Australian vibe and how it like bled into Moon versus Pandora and different language, and it was very much on point. And the way that this game's problems were mostly patched and fixed with time, even before the unofficial community patch arrived, is kind of an incentive for you not to really rush to get Borderlands or Gearbox games at launch. They're kind of like late bloomers. You don't get the most out of them until they've been patched and all the problems that players find and complain about are like addressed. But if I go over the points that I cited with Borderlands 2 one by one, of course the RPG elements are still there, but they're a little bit improved, a little bit. But I'm not going to go over those. They're going to explain themselves while I'm going through the list. If we discuss the story is still bad. You still have the exact same problem where you have a big build-up with lots of tied knots, and you're expecting a big resolution and like great writing to conclude all the problems that they introduced and all the plots and whatever, and it kind of never arrives. The vault is kind of like shoved in there. The moon vault, it kind of like became an issue. It really didn't need to exist. Like they should have focused on the Hyperion moon base and Jack. This new vault didn't really make much sense, even though, if I dare say so, it is the absolute best vault that we had in any Borderlands game when it comes to design and atmosphere. When you keep hearing about the vault, this alien technology, whatever, what you kind of should have gotten all along was something along the lines of this. Like a big crystal, megalithic alien structure, holograms. This is exactly what it should have been all along. Borderlands 1, Borderlands 2's vault, and the way the word vault was kind of like it lost its flavor, you know, like in Torg DLC, oh, we get a new vault and it's pathetic. They really should not be tossing around the word vault that hastily. And when I get vaults in Borderlands games, I want them to be like this one. This is something worthy of going through an entire game hearing about a vault. This is what is worthy of. This is what you should get at the end. Not something along the lines of Borderlands 1, and not something along the lines of the pathetic vault of Borderlands 2 and Torg and so on. So the story was still bad. Lilith kind of like jumps in at the end. Really, didn't make any sense. You had a like the robot army, the build-up of the robot army, and it really doesn't play any part of you retaking Helios. You kind of like go there and kill everybody on your own. Robots don't help that much. So yeah, the story was still bad. Sadly, that is not fixed. Like I said, they kind of like, it feels like they fire the writers halfway through. Like they hire writers just to knot things up. They write it halfway through and then they say, okay, fine, we can't pay you, just give us what you have and we write the rest. So that's really bad, and I hope that they address that. Like I said, the atmosphere is stronger than ever. The feel of the moon, how it feels very different, how it's very, very unique and differentiates itself from Pandora. Of course, the Claptrap DLC is, in my eyes, the best DLC that came, especially in terms of atmosphere, even better than Tiny Tina, but I would understand why people wouldn't agree with me on that. But still, even in the base game, you really had enough diversity, I feel. At least when it comes to comparing it to Borderlands 2. And the two vehicles you had were actually distinct for the first time. In Borderlands 1, we got scooters, and in General Knox DLC, we got more vehicles, but they were all, at the end, kind of like still four-wheeled things that varied in health and damage. When it comes to this game, the Moonzuni actually feels much better to drive. It is very, very, very good when it comes to handling and the overall feel of it. Sad you don't get to use it that much, but the Stingray is actually a very unique vehicle, and it suits the theme of the moon, where you can like perform these long jumps and you can squash people with it. So again, in a way, the things that were already strong about Borderlands 2 were made stronger in the pre-sequel. When it came to the DLC and the way it was handled, yes, you didn't get as much content, which could be interpreted as a weakness, again, because you don't get that much longevity out of the game. But once again, it kind of ties into my point when it comes to quality versus quantity. If you ignore the Holodome, which was just another Circle of Slaughter, again, which I'm going to talk about, you got the Claptastic Voyage, which in my book is the best Borderlands DLC ever. You don't have this cash grabby, recycled enemies. Enemies are really unique. The story kind of like ties in to the main continuity. You don't get something along the lines of Dr. Ned and his zombie island, where it's really not understandable whether it actually happened in the lore or not. So, and Pirate's Booty, where you get something completely disconnected from the main story, Claptastic Voyage actually ties in to the pre-sequel in Borderlands 2 and everything that happened. Enemy design in the Claptastic Voyage is not as oppressive as it was in the other DLCs. And I touched upon this, of course, when I discussed Borderlands 2. You either had reskinned bandits, or you had something along the lines of Scalians, which like needlessly resist everything except corrosive damage. You get skeletons, which you don't know what to kill them with. So yeah, and the pre-sequel is much more compact and much more like better planned, so to speak. It's not random. It's not like, oh, we have this new DLC, let's just reskin the enemies and call it a day. And the other thing that this small size carries with it is it's not as confusing. When you like recommend the pre-sequel to someone and he wants to play it, you don't really have to explain to him that much. Oh, the DLCs, like what order to play the DLCs in. Or it doesn't matter until you reach Tiny Tina, so play all the others until you reach Tiny Tina, then play Digistruct Peak maybe, then come play the pre-sequel, and then come back to play the Fight for Sanctuary. So yeah, when you have a compact, more realistic, let's say, DLC package, it becomes easier sort of to navigate. So again, and even though like there's one instant of it, and this like ties into the enemy design, you had less instances of like flying enemies where if you're a melee character like Athena here, you can't fight them. You didn't have as much skeletons that you don't know what to do with. So yeah, when it comes to mission design, story, and DLC, I'd say that the pre-sequel is, to summarize, more quality, even though there's less quantity. And with that, I'm going to transition over to my next point. So one more thing I forgot to mention in my previous point was that one of the other things that like contributed to the bad reputation it got, the pre-sequel, of course, is when it comes to like the characters. We still got Moxie, we still got Roland, Lilith, but Marcus isn't here. Nurse Nina is not as memorable and not as beloved as Dr. Zed. I wouldn't argue that Dr. Zed is very beloved. Of course, Janie Springs is definitely not as loved as Scooter. Pickles is not as good as Tiny Tina. And so overall with the characters, the NPCs, when it comes to these things, they kind of like drop the ball. Yeah. It's not as memorable, as like warm, as close to the heart as it is with the pre-sequel, with Borderlands 2. But if I carry on to my other points that I made about Borderlands 2, challenges are still here, sadly, and they still suck more than ever. In fact, they didn't like revisit any of them. The ones that were horrible were still horrible, like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Assault Rifle, which was actually made harder in this game because if you're crouching and you take a hit, which is not a bullet, the game immediately like snaps you out of crouch. So again, nobody cared about that apart from me. Area-specific challenges were much worse. You got way more missable challenges. You got one which is notoriously bugged, which is this one called Tread Carefully. A lot of them were incredibly difficult to get, and they just added to the frustration. So challenges were not improved upon, sadly, but nobody cared because nobody did challenges, except if you went for the trophy. Circles of Slaughter, the situation is kind of better, because we only have one Circle of Slaughter in the main game, and it's actually fun. It's not as long, it is not very oppressive, it doesn't have horrible music, the area is actually interesting, it's not like Think Slaughterhouse or the Hyperion, Orgasm with a violin playing. So the Circles of Slaughter are kind of better. I would have rathered Hollow Dome not be a DLC. That is very kind of like bad, but at least with the Hollow Dome, we got weapons, some of which are actually very, very, very usable, and we got more levels. So it was overall a good DLC package. Like, you could, instead of getting something like Ultimate Vault Hunter Pack, which you just simply pay for and get more levels and weapons, you got more weapons and levels, in addition to a kind of like Circle of Slaughter, which again isn't as bad as Borderlands 2's counterparts. Raid bosses. This is again something that people interpreted as bad, because the only quote-unquote real raid boss was the Empyrean Sentinel, which you got at the end of the game, which is the exact same as the final boss, only with amped up difficulty, which again a lot of people took issue to. There is Iwajira, but he's not technically a raid boss really. He's more of like a unique mini-boss, which you find in Serenity's Waste. Of course, everybody knows what I'm talking about. But in the base game, you got only one technically raid boss, and he's the exact same as the final boss of the game. Again, a lot of people consider that laziness and whatever, and it kind of is, yeah, to be fair. But the other side of the argument is that for once, finally, the final boss of a Borderlands game is not a complete pushover and has actually interesting design. The Empyrean Sentinel is much better than the Destroyer, than the Warrior, and it is actually kind of like the only instance where the final boss is actually challenging. If you go over if you consider Borderlands the pre-sequel of DLC, you have Borderlands 1, you got the Destroyer, notoriously bad boss. Zombie Island of Dr. Ned himself, not very good. Moxie's DLC Underdome, no raid bosses. General Knox, we got Chromerax, but the final boss himself, which is General Knox, is again a pushover. Claptastic Voyage, a lot of recycled bosses, and Claptrap himself, which is kind of okay. Not very difficult, but at least it was like conceptually good. Borderlands 2, we got the Warrior, sucks. We got the Leviathan, okay, in the Pirate's Booty. Torque's DLC, for some reason, decided to introduce kind of like raid difficulty boss in its final for its final mission, and he was not farmable. Hammerlock's DLC was a the prime example when it comes to bosses being wimps when it comes to Nakayama. And Tiny Tina's DLC is, of course, no different when it comes to the Handsome Sorcerer. Even the latest DLC, you have the exact same trend where the final boss is kind of like a pushover, and it's kind of like contradicts the story. He kicks everybody out of Sanctuary, then you find out that he's not very challenging at all. But here, the Empyrean Sentinel, he actually feels worthy of a final boss. And it is very nice that they kind of elaborated on the best part of Borderlands 1, which is not at all explored in Borderlands 2, which are the Guardians. It was kind of like the best thing about Borderlands 1, when you finally reach the end of the game and you're fighting these aliens which left the vault behind. And it was never revisited in Borderlands 2. And in Borderlands the pre-sequel here, when we get back to this structure, like I said, which is fantastic, and you start actually getting these aliens to spawn all around you, it is fantastic. It was one of the best things about the game. And like I said, it added to the atmosphere, and it was very unique enemy design where you, again, and I'm going to elaborate on this later on, have an example of an enemy whose shield is actually the most important part. Whereas you go through the entirety of Borderlands 2 not worrying about shields almost at all. And so... And even I could argue that not having stuff along the lines of Vermivorous the Invincible, where you have to go through a long, dreary process even to spawn him, where you don't have something like Dexy, these like secret, not so well rewarding raid bosses, it is much better to keep it compact and keep it down to something that actually works, like the Empyrean Sentinel, which is a very interesting fight. Multi-phases, you have a reason to use the environment. It is much better than Terramorphous, than pretty much all of... Wow, how did he drop an old paintball? I was killing him with an old paintball. So yeah, when it comes to raid bosses, I would much rather have this. And even in the DLC, the only quote-unquote raid boss we got was kind of, again, EOS and that Shadow Trap, which, once again, is much better than having to... when you focus on one boss to be your raid and simultaneously your final boss of the game, people who don't care about raiding and people who care about raiding kind of get the same experience, even though with varying difficulty. Again, I could understand that being interpreted as a weakness. I would have rathered more raid bosses if they are as unique and as rewarding to kill as something like the dragons. But if I'm going to have the Empyrean Sentinel compared to something like Terramorphous, Vermivorous, Voracitus, I would rather have the Empyrean Sentinel. So with that, I'm going to transition over to my next point. So again, I decided to split the video in two because it would have been too long, and I'm going to carry on talking about the rest of the points when it comes to the pre-sequel. But I'm going to end this one by citing two things I should have mentioned earlier, which are the final circle of slaughter the game kind of gives you is actually in the Claptastic Voyage, but it has a very unique and different take on it. They don't shove it down your throat. They don't force you to complete it. It's kind of like this completely optional area where you can tweak the combat to your liking. And you can use it if you really liked Circles of Slaughter. You can use it as a way of end game farming. You get chests at the end. You can modify the difficulty. You can modify. They gave you an option to like control gravity, control certain modifiers. What is strong, what is not. And so that is a much better Circle of Slaughter that something like Merlin's Temple gave us. So even if you didn't like Circles of Slaughter, even if you liked Circles of Slaughter, what Claptrap's Voyage gave you was something that you would have been content with. Either you don't want to touch it and you really don't need to, or if you really like them, you can have the best Circle of Slaughter you ever had, with enemy diversity, with modifiers, with great rewards at the end. Not great, but okay rewards. So that was the final point when it comes to Circles of Slaughter in the pre-sequel. And another thing I want to cite about the Empyrean Sentinel is that for once it kind of like applies the same when the same kind of like applies when it comes to EOS and the final boss of the Claptastic Voyage. But the Sentinel specifically finally broke the trend of raid bosses having simply these Nova attacks that you cannot hide from, that definitely hit you. You had that with Hyperius, you had that with Pyropete, where you kind of like have to hide behind the scaffolding. Not sure whether or not that was intended by the developers. The scaffolding is really like put there in weird angles. You had that with Voracitus. You had that pretty much with almost every raid boss in the game. You had these Nova attacks that definitely hit you no matter what you do. Even in some normal bosses, I believe even the Snowman, when he buried himself under the ground and he just like chased at you and burst from under, he would hit you no matter what. So all of that really emphasized the use of Moxie weapons, where you have these bursts where the boss must damage you, you health gate, you have to heal back above health gate, and so everybody used Moxie weapons. Finally, with the Empyrean Sentinel, you don't really have to do that. If you play carefully, if you're mindful, you can dodge a reasonable amount of his attacks, and almost, if you're super careful, almost never break your shield. So I really like that. And they generally, these bosses that have these Nova attacks, they generally gave you no means of second wind. Even Voracitus, he spawns those stupid midgets that he himself then kills, I believe, or even if he doesn't, you can't reliably second wind during the fight. So it became a Moxie weapon fest, and that is not the case with the Empyrean Sentinel, which is why I consider him to be the best boss in the game, the best raid boss, and kind of like all Borderlands games almost. With that, I'm going to end this video, and I'm going to shove the rest of the points I made into a separate one, which I'm going to upload after this. So until then, take care.